He had everything a man could want: a company worth hundreds of millions, a penthouse overlooking Lake Ontario, and a calendar full of meetings that other people would have given years of their lives to attend. What Connor Blackwell did not have at 38 years old was a single person in his life who looked at him and saw anything other than the number in his bank account. That realization didn't arrive gently. It arrived on a Tuesday night in February at a restaurant on King Street West that had a 3-month wait list, sitting across from the 14th woman his assistant had set him up with through an exclusive matchmaking service. Her name was Tiffany, and she was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Polished, deliberate, exhausting to look at for too long. Within 11 minutes of sitting down, she had mentioned her condo in Yorkville twice, her recent trip to Monaco, and the fact that her father ran things at a Bay Street firm Connor had done business with. She hadn't asked him a single question. He excused himself to use the restroom and stood at the sink for a long moment, water running cold over his hands, staring at his own reflection. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. He went back to the table, paid for both their drinks, and told Tiffany it had been lovely to meet her. She smiled and said they should do it again sometime. He knew they wouldn't. Outside, on the sidewalk, with February biting through his coat, Connor Blackwell made a decision that his CFO would have called irrational, his mother would have called long overdue, and which he himself couldn't fully explain. He was going to find out, once and for all, whether anyone in this city would want him if he had nothing. He called his assistant that night and told her to cancel everything for 6 weeks. Then he called his driver and told him not to come in Monday. He took the blazers out of his closet, pushed them to the back, and pulled out a pair of jeans he hadn't worn in 4 years. It started as an experiment. He told himself that. Just data collection. He created a profile on a regular dating app, not the elite one his lawyer used, not the curated service that charged $4,000 a month. A regular one. Photo taken in his kitchen, no tie, no context. Name Connor, occupation, between jobs. The first 3 dates were a study in rapid disenchantment. The women were perfectly pleasant until the subject of work came up, and then a particular flatness entered their eyes, a recalibration, and the conversation shortened itself efficiently toward goodbye. He wasn't offended. He was, if anything, fascinated. He had become, without his money, genuinely uninteresting to a specific category of person. The data was clean and consistent. By the 7th date, he had stopped finding it fascinating. By the 12th, he had started to wonder if there was something wrong with him that had nothing to do with money at all. He was at a coffee shop on Dundas Street West after the 15th failed meeting. A woman named Kendra, who had looked at her phone 11 times in 40 minutes. When he noticed the woman behind the counter, she was arguing, cheerfully and without any apparent self-consciousness, with the espresso machine. Not fixing it. Not calling someone to fix it. Just talking to it. Telling it, in a firm and reasonable tone, that it had 2 options: cooperate or be replaced. The machine cooperated. Her name tag said Brooke. She had flour on the left sleeve of her green apron, and when she handed him his coffee, she looked at him directly in a way that most people didn't, like she was actually curious about what she'd find there. "You look like someone just told you some genuinely bad news," she said. Not unkindly, just matter of fact. 15 first dates in 2 months, he said, because he was tired and he'd stopped being careful. She tilted her head. 15? What are you doing wrong? That, he said, is the question. She laughed. It was a real laugh, short and unguarded. Come back Friday, she said. I make better coffee when it's not a Tuesday. He had no logical reason to go back on Friday. He went back on Friday. Her full name was Brooke Callahan. She'd grown up in a small town 4 hours north of Toronto, in a place where the main employers were a lumber operation and seasonal tourism, and a stubborn optimism about both. Her mother had died when Brooke was 19, which had ended her first attempt at university and brought her back home for 2 years to take care of her younger brother Aiden, who was 12 and suddenly motherless and needed someone steady. When she finally came back to the city, she worked 2 jobs for 3 years to finish her degree in environmental science at Ryerson, and she still worked at the coffee shop because the degree hadn't yet converted into something that paid enough to cover rent in a city that had lost its mind about rent. She told him none of this on Friday. She told him almost none of it for several weeks. What she did was ask him questions, real ones, the kind that required him to actually think. and listened to the answers without performing interest. It was so different from what he was used to that he initially mistook it for indifference. It wasn't indifference. It was simply that she wasn't trying to impress him, and she didn't particularly need him to impress her. And that combination produced a quality of attention he hadn't experienced since he was young and unimportant, and people talked to him just because they felt like talking to him. He told her he was doing some consulting work, which was technically true in the broadest interpretation of the word. He told her he was in between things. She nodded like this was a reasonable human condition, which he was beginning to understand. It was. They started meeting at a park on Saturday mornings. She brought coffee from work in a thermos. She always got the proportions exactly right, which she said was a matter of principle, and they walked along the water and talked about things he hadn't talked about with anyone in years. What he actually believed about the city. What he thought Canada was doing wrong with its housing policy. Whether it was possible to love a place and be furious at it simultaneously. She had opinions about all of it, grounded and specific, and she delivered them without apology and without performance. And Connor found himself doing something he almost never did in conversation, which was changing his mind. In the 4th week, he told her something he hadn't told anyone, that when he was 24, he had borrowed $60,000 from his parents to start his first business, and it had failed within 18 months, and he had spent 2 years working 3 jobs to pay them back. And that period, broke, humiliated, working, had been the period of his life when he had been most certain of who he was. He'd lost that certainty somewhere in the accumulation of success. He was trying to find it again. Brooke was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most honest thing you've told me." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Why are you telling me now?" He didn't have an answer that was small enough to be safe, so he said the true one. "Because I think you'd notice if I didn't." She looked away at the water. He couldn't read her expression. After a moment she said, "I would've." He didn't tell her who he was. Every week he meant to, and every week something stopped him. Not cowardice exactly, or not only cowardice, but a genuine terror of watching her eyes change the way Tiffany's had changed, and Kendra's had changed, and all the others, that recalibration, that flicker of calculation. He couldn't bear to see it in her. So he kept the lie small and warm and fed it carefully, and told himself he'd fix it soon. What he didn't know was that the lie was already beginning to cost him things he hadn't realized he was spending. It was a colleague of his, a man named Richard, who ran the investment arm of Blackwell Group, and had the social awareness of a parking meter, who undid it. Richard ran into them at a restaurant in the Distillery District in early April, a place Connor had forgotten he'd ever been to because he'd attended so many restaurant openings they'd blurred together. Richard clapped him on the shoulder and said, loudly and with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once in his life read a room, "Connor Blackwell, I thought you were in Vancouver this week, the board meeting." He stopped when he saw Connor's face. He did not stop soon enough. The name landed between them on the table like something dropped from a height. Brooke didn't say anything right away. She picked up her water glass and set it down again. Connor could see her processing it. The name, the board meeting, the reaction on his face that confirmed everything before he said a word. Richard made his excuses with the grace of a man who had finally, at least, read the room and disappeared. "Connor Blackwell," Brooke said. Her voice was completely level. "As in Blackwell Group, yes. As in the development company that's been buying up half the land north of Bloor for the last 5 years, among other things." She looked at him for a long time, not with anger, exactly, with something more careful and more painful than anger. "How long?" "Since the beginning. Since before the coffee shop." "Yes." She nodded slowly. Then she folded her napkin, placed it on the table, and picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. "I need to go," she said. She said it the way people say things when they are holding themselves together very deliberately, each word placed with precision. "Brooke, not tonight," she said. "Please." He sat alone at the table for a long time after she left. The food arrived and he didn't touch it. He thought about the ways he had justified the deception to himself, the experiment, the data, the fear, and they all turned to nothing when he held them up against the look on her face. Not betrayal exactly. Worse. Disappointment. The quiet, thorough kind. He sent her one message that night. It said, "I'm sorry. I want to explain if you'll let me. But I understand if you won't." She didn't reply. What Connor didn't know, because he'd been so consumed with managing his own guilt, was that Brooke hadn't simply been blindsided by the name. She'd been blindsided by something more specific than that, and more devastating. 3 years earlier, before she'd come back to Toronto, she had been working on a small environmental assessment project through a nonprofit she volunteered with. A project in a rural community north of Sudbury, where her family's land still sat. Land that had been in her mother's family for 2 generations. The development company that had acquired the surrounding area and made the community's position economically untenable, that had, in effect, made staying impossible for most of the families there, had been Blackwell Group. She hadn't connected the name to Connor's face. Why would she? Connor had presented himself as a man between jobs, a man finding his footing, a man who borrowed $60,000 from his parents and paid it back with his hands. She sat in her apartment on Roncesvalles that night and looked at her phone and thought about the careful way he'd listened to her talk about her hometown, about her mother's land, about the communities that got hollowed out when corporations made spreadsheet decisions, about places where people actually lived. She thought about how attentive he'd been, how interested, and she didn't know. She had no way of knowing whether any of it had been real. Her brother Aidan called her on Thursday night. He was 24 now and studying environmental law at Dalhousie, and he had a frankness that had either always been there or had arrived with their mother's death and never left. She told him most of it, editing out the parts she was still too raw to say out loud. When she finished, there was a pause. "Do you think he knew?" Aidan said. "About Mom's land? I don't know. That's the question, though." "I know it's the question. What does your gut say?" She was quiet for a moment. "My gut says he didn't. My gut also says I'm not objective." "Your gut's usually right," Aidan said. "That doesn't mean it's right this time, but it usually is." She didn't reply to Connor's message that night. She called a woman she knew at City Planning who had access to the corporate filings from the Sudbury area development. She spent 2 hours going through what was publicly available. What she found was complicated in the way that real things are complicated, which is to say it wasn't clean, and it wasn't simple, and it didn't resolve into a satisfying narrative either way. What she found was that Blackwell Group had acquired that land in a transaction that had been legal and arm's length, and that Connor had signed off on from 3 levels of corporate distance, almost certainly without knowing whose land it was, or that a woman named Brooke Callahan had spent 20 years paying off the mortgage on a small house on 15 acres that her daughter would never inherit because the appraisal had come in low, and the offer had come in at exactly the appraisal, and her mother had accepted it because she was already sick, and she was tired, and it seemed like enough. It was not Connor's fault. It was not his fault either. It existed in the space between those 2 things, where most of the real damage in the world tends to live. She replied to his message on Sunday morning. She said, "There's something you should know. Can we meet somewhere neutral?" They met at a coffee shop she'd chosen specifically because it wasn't one she worked at or cared about. She told him about the land. She told him about her mother. She told him about the assessment project and when she'd realized the connection and what she'd found in the filings. She told him all of it without drama, because she was too exhausted for drama, and she watched his face change as she spoke in a way she hadn't seen it change before. He didn't make excuses. She'd half expected him to. The corporate distance, the chain of decisions, the technical legality of all of it. He didn't reach for any of that. He sat with it. "I didn't know about your mother," he said, "or that it was your family's land. I want you to know that. But I also—" He stopped. "I signed off on a lot of transactions in that period without asking the questions I should have been asking, about who was on the other side of them, about what it meant for people who weren't on a spreadsheet." He looked at his hands. "I didn't know, but I should have built a system where I would have known." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was the truest thing he could have said, and she recognized it as true, and that recognition was its own complicated thing to sit with. "The deception," she said. "I know. That's separate from the land. That's about me specifically. About choosing to lie to me specifically while we were building." She stopped. "I know," he said again. "I was afraid. That's not an excuse. I was afraid that if you knew, you'd look at me the way everyone else looks at me, and I couldn't handle it from you. That sounds like I'm making it about me. It is about you." "Yes," she looked at him. "Why did it matter what I thought?" We'd known each other 6 weeks. He didn't answer right away. When he did, he said, "Because you were the first person in a long time who made me feel like I was worth talking to. Just talking to. Not the company, not the portfolio, me." He paused. "I realize that makes the deception worse, not better. I was protecting something I hadn't earned yet." She looked away. Outside the window, a streetcar went by, almost empty, the afternoon light flat and gray in the way that April in Toronto sometimes insists on. "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I know, I'm not sure I'm going to. I know that too. But I don't think you knew about my mother. And I think the rest of it," she shook her head. "I don't know what to do with the rest of it yet." "That's honest," he said. "That's all I know how to be." She left the coffee shop before him. He sat alone for a while, which was something he'd been doing more of lately, and which no longer felt the way it used to feel. Like failure, like evidence. It felt more like something he was learning to be comfortable inside of. What Connor did next was not a gesture. He was careful about that. He'd spent enough time around wealthy people doing gestures, grand, expensive, self-congratulatory gestures, to be allergic to them. He didn't call a press release. He didn't announce anything. He called the director of his corporate affairs division and asked her to pull every file related to rural land acquisitions in the last 7 years. He then called his head of legal and asked them to develop a community impact review process that would have caught, 7 years ago, a situation where a family was selling their home under economic duress because a corporation had acquired the surrounding area and made staying untenable. It took 3 months to build. It wasn't perfect. He didn't tell Brooke about it. She found out because Aidan found out. Aidan, who was writing a paper on corporate land ethics, and who had set up a Google alert for Blackwell Group, and who called his sister on a Wednesday in July to say, with the cautious neutrality of someone trying not to influence a jury, that apparently Blackwell Group had quietly implemented a community consultation framework that a land rights organization in Sudbury was calling the most substantive corporate policy change they'd seen from a developer in 15 years. Brooke didn't call Connor. She thought about it for a week. She thought about the difference between a gesture and a change, and how you could tell them apart, and whether this was one or the other, and whether it mattered to her either way. She showed up at his office on a Friday afternoon. She hadn't told him she was coming. The receptionist looked at her the way receptionists at places like this look at people who arrive without appointments in green work aprons, and Brooke looked back at her in the way she had always looked at people who underestimated her, which was with perfect patience and no visible concern. She told the receptionist her name. 2 minutes later, Connor was in the lobby. He looked surprised, not in a managed way. Genuinely surprised, and then something else, something less composed, something he didn't try to hide. "I heard about the policy," she said. "Okay," he said. "I wanted to ask you in person if you did it because of me." She could see him actually thinking about it, not preparing an answer. "Partly," he said, "but it was the right thing to do. It would have been the right thing to do if I'd never met you. But you might not have done it." "No," he said, "I might not have." She nodded. "That's an honest answer. I'm trying to get better at those." She looked at him for a long moment. The lobby was quiet around them. Somewhere above them, 40 floors of business continued doing whatever business does. "I still haven't forgiven you," she said. "I heard you the first time. But I'd like to get coffee sometime," she said. "Real coffee. Not from my work, somewhere neither of us has anything to prove." He said yes. It came out immediately before he could manage it, which was, she thought, probably a good sign. They met the following Saturday at a place on College Street that neither of them had been to before. There were no menus with wine lists. The chairs didn't match. A dog was sleeping under the table by the window, and no one appeared to find this remarkable. They ordered coffee and didn't talk about the company, or the land, or the months between. They talked about what Aidan was writing his paper on. They talked about a documentary she'd watched about the boreal forest. They talked about what Connor had been like at 15, which turned out to be exactly as awkward as she'd guessed, and funnier than he'd expected to admit. There were 7 more Saturdays like that before he took her hand one afternoon on the walk back to the streetcar stop, and she let him, and neither of them said anything about it, because nothing needed to be said. There was a conversation 6 weeks after that, in her apartment, quiet and serious, about what they were doing. and what it meant, and it was not a simple conversation, and it didn't arrive at a simple answer. But it arrived at a true one, which was that they were both willing to find out. Connor's mother met Brooke at Christmas. His mother, Eleanor Blackwell, who had survived 40 years of Bay Street dinner parties and 4 corporate board memberships and one famously acrimonious merger that had been written about in the Globe, spent 11 minutes talking to Brooke in the kitchen before pulling her son aside to tell him, in the direct and undecorated way she had communicated everything since he was 7 years old, that he had managed to find someone with more backbone than everyone else in the room combined, and that he should not do anything stupid. He told his mother he was trying. Eleanor said that was a start. What Connor did in the spring of the following year was not a grand gesture. It was a set of things, small and deliberate. He worked with the land rights organization in Sudbury to create a fund, not named after himself or the company, that provided support for families in similar situations to the Callahans. Brooke found out about it the same way she found out about most things he did. Later than he intended, because he was still learning that honesty and transparency were not the same as disclosure, and that the person he wanted to be was still a project he was working on. She was sitting at his kitchen table, reading the organization's annual report. Aidan had forwarded it. When he came in from the other room, she looked up at him. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I was afraid you'd think it was a gesture." "Is it a gesture?" "No," he said. "But I understand why you'd wonder." She set the report down. "I don't wonder," she said. "That's the thing. I've stopped wondering." He sat down across from her. "What does that mean?" She looked at him in the way she had looked at him that first day across the counter, direct and genuinely curious, like she was interested in what she'd find. "It means I trust you," she said. "I didn't think I was going to, but I do." She paused. "Don't make me regret it." "I won't," he said. She gave him a look that said she was reserving judgment, which was fair, and which he'd learned was not the opposite of trust but part of it. Outside, it was a Saturday in April, and the street was waking up the way Toronto streets wake up in spring after a long winter, loudly, messily, with an intensity that is slightly embarrassing and completely sincere. A city that could make you furious and break your heart and still, despite everything, feel like home. Connor Blackwell, sitting across from the woman who had seen him before he was worth anything to her and had kept looking anyway, thought that this was probably what it felt like to have found something real, not clean, not easy, not without cost, but real. That was enough. That was, it turned out, the thing he had been looking for all along.